Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Ellen, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
So good morning. It's pretty early here in Montana, but my name's Ellen Baumler, and I'm a historian. I have a PhD actually in Latin classics and English and medieval history, but there are no jobs there. So I have actually, I wouldn't trade it for anything, but it did teach me a lot of really good research skills, which has sort of got me into the job that I was hired to do here in Montana. I worked for 26 years as the interpretive historian at the Montana Historical Society. I retired in 2018. But during the course of my career, I was actually hired to write and research National Register interpretive plaques. So I did probably 1,600 signs across the state on all kinds of different properties. And, it sort of allowed me to collect a lot of stories. I know the history. I probably know more trivia than anybody. but it it really did serve me well. And the stories that I couldn't put on signs, I sort of have collected and put into 5 different books on haunted places in Montana. So it's been a long time of my, collecting these stories. And I still have more that I hope I'm going to be able to do another book. But that sort of, tells you about me. I actually got into this because of my own house. So would you like to hear about that?
So, if it's a paranormal story, I'm in. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is really what happened to me. And we came to Montana in 1988. My husband is an archaeologist, and he had gotten the job of state archaeologist at that point. And we came from Tucson. We had 3 days. The moving van was right behind us, and we had 3 days to find a place to live. And so we desperately looked for a house, and we finally found this house that happened to be empty. And it was the last thing the realtor showed us. And we stepped across the threshold, and I knew that we had really come home. And we still live in the house today. It was at that point in 1988, the house was celebrating its 100th birthday. And so it was kind of perfect for us, to move into this historic home. So the first night that I spent in the house, I knew there was something different about it. I awakened to the sound of this radio. The radio is very, very staticky and annoying. And I thought, well, maybe my clock radio had gotten messed up in the move. So I reached over to turn it off, but it wasn't on. So I got up and I searched the house, and I couldn't find any reason for this weird static. And I went back to bed and sort of could hear threads of music. I could hear talking, almost like an interview. And finally I drifted back to sleep and forgot about it the next morning. But then it happened for 2 more nights. And the third time it happened, and next morning I got up, I said to my husband, there's something in the house that's keeping me awake. And he said, looked at me really weird. And he said, have you heard the radio too? So I knew it wasn't just me, and over the next few years, we just sort of lived with it. And sometimes it would happen. It was very random. So we had befriended this very elderly gentleman and his sister who had grown up in our house in the 1910s. They were very, very elderly when we met them. And they loved to come to visit us, and they would tell us what it was like to live in the house in the 1910s and 20s. And so one day we took them on a tour of the house, and we took them upstairs. And we get to the top of the stairs, and the guy turns to me and he says, now that I remember, he said, back in the 1910s, when I was a kid, I had Helena's very first radio operation set up in that room. it took, we played it all the time, and my mother hated it because people came from all over the place just to hear my radio. And I said to him, well, sometimes we hear this radio in the night. What was the reception like on that radio? Oh, he said it was full of static all the time. And so, it just taught me a lot about residual energy. So I'm a really big fan of residual energy. And I think a lot of times when people experience things, that's what the explanation is. Not all the time, but a lot of the time.
Now, when we say residual energy, it doesn't have to be just a death. It can just be something that was very impactful in there.
Something that has happened repeatedly in a place, it doesn't even the person doesn't even have to have passed away, really. Um, you know, we ask this question: what happens to energy? People are made of energy, and when a person dies, what happens to their energy? We don't really know. And it's the same thing with electrical equipment. When it's turned off, what happens to that energy that was there before? So to me, I mean, it's a good explanation of a lot of things: footsteps in an empty house, or cigar smoke, or old perfume wafting around, or breezes, or whatever. To me, that residual energy is a good explanation.
Do you believe in an afterlife?
Well, let's say I'm open to it.
I'm probably in the same boat.
I would much rather tell someone else's experience. Although I feel like, you have to be in a certain place at a certain time to have a paranormal experience. I have a hard time believing that people can go in and investigate and call that up. I just tend to think that it's different planes that come together, and when the time is right, certain things might happen. And that's been my experience anyway, because I'm not a sensitive person, but I feel like I've been in the right place at the right time, you know, certain times in my life to have, things happen. I don't know if that explains it, but
Could I ask for an example? Because there're just some things you can't explain. Like there's just weird things that just happen, and there's no like, there's this, there's that, there's none of that. But then I don't necessarily believe in the whole like fortune teller stuff. I'm more like there's just random things I've had and happen in my own life, which is like you're trying to scientifically figure out what that is, and there's not really an explanation for it.
no. I mean, I think that those experiences have to be random, because if they weren't random, we would be able to explain them. And then it wouldn't be fun anymore. I mean, I hope they never do find the actual explanation for some of these things. But yeah, so, one example, there's I spent a lot of time in Virginia City, Montana, which is a gold mining community. It was a place that was the original or the second territorial capital, and there was a lot of energy that was expended there because of the gold rush. And as a state employee, we did a lot of work there. I did a lot of interpretive plaques there on most of the buildings. I mean, there are 80 buildings left from the 1860s, which is more than any other place of the era in the West. And anyway, there's a lot of energy there. And there's a place called the Bonanza Inn, which was the original Madison County Courthouse, built in 1865 and used until 1875. And then it was converted into a hospital by three nuns who came from Leavenworth, Kansas, Sisters of Charity. And they ran a hospital for miners for about 3 years. And then the mining was kind of finished and they moved on. But one of those sisters, Sister Irene, was a very young, very beautiful, unprofessed novice, and she went out into the community, to visit the poor and the sick and that, because she wasn't really a professional nurse like the other two. Anyway, she supposedly comes back to but the Bonanza Inn to sit by the bedside of people who stay there. It's kind of like a dormitory now. And as a state worker, I stayed there a lot of different times. And one time, I was there in the building by myself. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Had been a very hot day. I was there to give a lecture at 5 o'clock, and the front door and the back door were locked. All of the other bedroom doors were locked. And I sat down. I was staying in the front of the building in this one room, and I sat down on the bed to sort of go over my notes. And I began to hear these footsteps, and it sounded like somebody in serviceable shoes, starting way at the end of the hallway at the back of the building. I could hear this person walking. About midway up the hallway, she stopped, and I could hear the key go into the door lock, and I could hear the key turn. I could hear the door swing open. I could hear footsteps going into that room, and the door shut, and then it was done. And I just feel sure that that was Sister Irene, visiting me. It was a very uncanny experience, and it wasn't scary. It was just, very interesting, and it definitely happened. I wasn't asleep. I was sitting there. So, that's one thing that happened to me, and I've had several other similar types of experiences. But again, I feel like you have to be in the right place at the right time for those planes to come together, for those random things to happen.
Did it cause you to, I guess, dig deeper into the history of some of the places?
Well, I had already very much researched Sister Irene, and I felt like I knew her pretty well. My take on it is that when things happen to people in the present, if you look to the history of the place, oftentimes you can actually explain what's happened by looking at the past. Nobody else seems to do that. And that's what my books are. I take something that happens to someone and look at the history and see if I can explain, what's happened by looking at the history of the place. And it's just amazing how often you can really link the present to the past like that. So I have another great example if you have time to hear that.
Yeah.
So the very first story that I actually wrote down and researched and wrote down happened also in Virginia City. This is a place that has a lot of stories, and people tell a lot of things that simply aren't, I don't believe, are true. But I was doing a National Register sign for this little tiny cabin, and the owner called me and said, I'd really like for you to do some research on this little cabin because there's a story. He said, I've just bought it and I'm going to use it as a rental. And before I rent it out to tenants, I'd like to know if there's any truth to this story that goes around the community. So he told me that the previous owner of the cabin had lived there for 30 years, and her name was Lucille, and they called her Loose Wheel around in the community because she would go around and tell this story about how she would see this bloody apparition in her bathtub. And she saw it all the time. And anybody that would listen to her, she would tell them, oh, I have this cabin and I see this bloody apparition in the bathtub. And so the new owner said, see if you can find any thread or any truth to that story. So I thought, oh, sure, I'm going to be able to find something, to explain that. But sure enough, I did a lot of research on that little tiny cabin. And I discovered that maybe the third or fourth occupants in the 1910s was an older couple, and the guy died of Spanish influenza in 1919. The wife was bereft, and I went through a lot of research to find what happened to her. And finally, I found her date of death, looking at the death records and things. And I went up to the cemetery and I found a big headstone for this couple. And I found his name on one side of the headstone, and the other side was blank. So I thought, well, I know there's somebody buried there because you can tell. And I went to see what happened to Amanda, the wife, and I came across uh, her death date. So I looked it up in the newspapers and I found this article. It was a very graphic article that said something to the effect of, last Wednesday, Amanda McKean went to Butte apparently for the purpose of buying a revolver. She brought it back to her house in Virginia City, entered the bathroom, and dislodged a bullet in her brain. If that doesn't explain the bloody apparition in the bathtub, I don't know what does. So that became the very first story that I actually researched and collected and wrote down.
That's insane.
Yeah. And that taught me, that you can look at things that happen, unexplained things that happen to people in the present, and look at the real history of the place. And oftentimes you can really explain.
My, when my buddy goes on these paranormal hunts, his name's Mikey Bowser. He has an episode on here you probably really enjoy, and he was showing some of his footage that he had. And I'm telling you, hearing it is not the same thing as either seeing it or just, but you could still get goosebumps off of stuff like that. And I was asking him, he was like, "Well, we did research into it, and it helps explain a lot of this." And
Exactly.
there was
Hmm.
a call girl or a prostitute, I guess, back then at one of the hotels, and a firework had gone off from below, and a piece of shrapnel had sliced her throat, and she died in that room. And he's like communicating with it. He has this little light, and can you turn the light on? And the light goes on. And I'm like, so there's different things. There's things that I believe are like an echo, which is like some people, like something happens, they just get caught in this loop that repeats over and over and over again. But then there's like if it's still around there, but it's not able to like visualize itself, it's just acting upon like sound or some type of frequency in a radio or something.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I agree with you. I think there are different ways that people do experience the paranormal. And I have this one other really weird story about a different type of experience of a friend whose name was Ken Walton, and he was a person that was a colleague of mine at the Montana Historical Society. And he told me one time that he'd had this strange experience where he had a an acquaintance who practiced Eckankar. People who practice that type of religion believe that they can teleport themselves. They can dream themselves into a place where they physically aren't, basically.
Sign me up. Sign me up.
And so anyway, he had this conversation with the guy one time downtown on the street, and he didn't pay that much attention to it. He went to bed that night, and next morning, his wife said, I had this really strange dream that there was this man in our room, and he was standing at the foot of the bed. And Ken said, "Well, what did he look like?" She said, "Well, I can describe him perfectly. He was bald. He had glasses. He had on this blue plaid shirt." Describing the guy that Ken had the conversation with the day before. And so a couple of weeks later, when Ken met this guy again, the guy said to him, "So do you remember that conversation we had a couple of weeks ago?" And Ken said, "Yeah, I remember." And the guy said, "And so that night, did your wife have a visitor at the foot of the bed?" So if you think about that, I mean, maybe people who do have these very vivid dreams about being in a place, maybe their essence is actually there. You know what I mean?
It's like astral projection a little bit.
Kind of like that. Yeah, it's kind of like that. And I mean, I don't know that I totally believe in that, but I do know that sometimes people have repeated dreams and they dream about a place that they've, maybe never really been, or a place that's familiar. And I mean, I had one time I had an experience in my house that was really strange where I was cleaning the bathroom mirror. That this bathroom is off the kitchen, and I had a clear view of the kitchen behind me as I was cleaning this mirror. And I saw somebody walk through my kitchen. I thought it was my husband coming home from an errand, so I ran out into the dining room, and there was nobody around. And I like to think that maybe someone who lived in my house before, who might not even be dead, was dreaming about walking through my kitchen, and that's what I saw. At least to me, that's a, a better explanation than other things I can think of.
You mentioned that you weren't sensitive, and that usually gets brought up when it comes to these types of conversations. Usually people talk about being some people are so sensitive they can actually sense thing. And I do believe that, there's some things that like
I
about
believe that too.
we're filled with energy, and people talk about like where does it go? It doesn't just like disappear into I don't really believe that. I think it fades into stuff. But when it talks about, like, being sensitive and being like, I get deja vu all the time, and, I've talked about this story before, but I had a dream about, this guy. It was like it was an African American guy. He was laying down in this marsh area, and I knew it looked like a place in my town. And I went downstairs, and I was, like, all kinda, like, a little bit like that really intense dream, and I was, like, kinda shaken up about it, and my mom asked, "Hey, what's wrong with you?" And I explained what happened, and then she pulls out a photo, and it's that guy, but it said missing. She's like, "Where exactly did you see this?" And I explained the general area, and they found the person a day later in that exact area. I swear to you, I've said that on the show multiple times before whenever I get into a paranormal discussion, but the one like, there's there type of weird stuff, but remember there when a little girl went missing a while ago called Sarah Foxwell, I think her name was. It was probably I would have been 12 years old, so been like 10 years ago, something like that. My mom had a dream about where this girl was, and my dad doesn't believe any of that stuff. He's like, "Shut up, it's not real." Don't. And my mom's like, "If you don't call where this little girl said that where her body was, then I'm gonna do it." And my dad's like, "Fine, I did it." They did it, found the body exactly where my mom said it was. And I mean, my dad's been a believer ever since. So I'm like, there's that weird stuff that gives you goosebumps, and it's like, how does that happen? And I think it's just because, and I, I, I mean, people talk about technology interfering with a lot of this type of stuff, and I go, there's definitely something there. More people are sensitive to this type of stuff than other people. They're able to hear things. They're able to have deja vu. I mean, kids get deja vu all the time,
All the
and
time, yeah.
we just explain it as it just goes away. I'm like, well, maybe for some people it doesn't just go away. Maybe it's just this thing that they can't predict happening. They can't focus. And that's why people write tons of books on this stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And one thing that does concern me is that, paranormal investigations are such a popular thing to do, and there's so many people that are involved in that. And one thing is that, when someone does an investigation like that, they have permission of the building owner, or wherever the place is, they have permission to do that, but they don't often follow up. And I think that's really unfortunate, because a lot of times, that information can be really valuable. But also, I think we have, in Montana, there's in Butte, which is a huge mining community, copper mining place. It has a very, very rich history, a very interesting place. But there's a brothel there that's very famous, called the Dumas. And back in the 90s, before anybody did any paranormal investigating, I did an article on the history of prostitution in Butte, which is a long and interesting thing. But anyway, I spent quite a bit of time interviewing the owner of the building, and I know all of its nooks and crannies and stuff. And there have been so many people going in there and investigating. I think whatever the essence of that was originally in that building, the energy of the women that was there, and stuff. I think it has been overridden by so many investigators going in there, leaving their own baggage there, if you know what I mean. That I think that the real story has gotten blurred, and people now go in there and investigate, and they say, oh, they got this murder, and they got this, and they got that. And I don't believe that it's really the root of the original energy of the building, if that makes sense. It's been so over investigated that you can't really get, even a sensitive person is going to get somebody else's uh baggage. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, we have a weird thing in our society where we've always profited off of death, from selling coffins at Costco to the whole industry, and then it's even like that even with the afterlife aspects of things too, which makes it like there's things you stumble upon in your everyday life that are just weird and like kind of interesting, and you can't really explain them. And then there's going out and looking for them, which I mean, if that's what someone wants to do on a day, sure. But I mean, there's just people that end up turning something like there's so many haunted locations that are charging $1,000 or something like that, where it's like, what's the original kind of like, I mean, you're not just gonna randomly stumble upon one of these things, but, like, going to an insane asylum or like Alcatraz and then going there at night. And then you see shows like X-Files that really kind of show you all that type, which I mean, I get it if they're trying to do their show or something like that. But also if it's real, like you should just show the real aspects to it, not need to fantasy it up.
Exactly. I think I've been interviewed and I've done research for probably half a dozen of those types of shows. And I mean, in my experience with that, they have a script before they ever go to the place. They have a story they want to tell that's not necessarily anything to do with what really happened there. And then they take the history and they make it fit their script. And what you see on those shows is never in my experience anyway, it's never ever what really happens. What really happens is much more interesting than the script they have.
Did you ever investigate any of those mines that they had and see if there was any residual energy around there? I
You
have to
know,
think.
personally, I don't really do investigations myself. I've been on some of them, you know, but I do know that there are things that happen in the mines in Butte in particular. There have been so many horrible um, explosions and accidents in that, you know, there's bound to be residual energy. And one of the things that I do know, in 1917, the speculator mining disaster killed, I think it was, oh, I don't know, dozens and dozens of people. And they were trapped in there and actually suffocated after the explosion closed off the mine. And they scrawled letters to their loved ones, and there's a very very moving tribute that has facsimiles of those some of those messages that the men left to their families. I mean, it's very very sad. That mine was closed for a long time, for decades, and in the 1940s it opened again, and the first folks down there um, could hear the breathing of the men as they suffocated, you know. So that residual energy is in those places for sure.
Have you looked through all your work and just understanding the history? Do you see how people view their history? Do you think it's like people are aware of things? Do you think time, like you get to see the time move on? If you're looking at something from the 1900s and then you get to see what happens today, is that place still a place? Is it a memorial or is it just something that moved on and they built something over top of it? Because I've kind of had this question about like, what is that extended period of time of when it's okay to do something or when that loss aspect or that gravity of that situation, something that could be so impactful? What's that time period to when it's okay? And I know it's different per person, but like when does a society come to grips with what happened and then move on?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it depends on the community, and it depends on how the community views whatever event it was. I think a lot of times, at least here in Montana, people want to commemorate those dire events. We had in 1959, there was a horrible earthquake that happened, and it created a lake that we call Quake Lake, Hebgen Lake. And I think, you know, there were some 30 people were buried and the bodies were never recovered. It was just a horrible disaster. It was a camping area. Um, and these people were camping, and the essentially the mountain came down on them. And you know, they have done a memorial, but it takes a while, I think, for that horrible the horror to kind of sink in and become a little bit less traumatic, maybe for the second generation that it didn't directly affect. And so, in the case of this particular one, which happened in 1959, the monument that they have there is fairly recent. And I think oftentimes it does take the passage of time, you know, and the second generation or even the third generation coming up to want to commemorate that for a community.
Now, this is going to be a two-part question, but it doesn't have to be paranormal related. But when it comes to the most interesting thing to you, about what you came across the history, any events, and then also the second part of that question is like, what's the, I guess, most, I wouldn't say scariest, but worst thing you probably came across?
Um, well, probably, gee, I've come across so many different places and so many different stories. It's really hard to sort out what would be the most interesting. I mean, I don't know how to answer that first part, but the second part, um, as far as the scariest thing, there are two things. I don't really get scared about this because I don't usually think it's something that is going to harm you. But there is one story that just totally freaks me out. And it's a story that happened fairly recently and the family's still around, so it's like I can't really write about it. But it happened in a house that's actually down the street from where I live. And in the 1930s, there was a couple that had lived there for many, many years. And the guy, I think he must have been suffering from dementia or something. Anyway, he attacked his wife with an axe, and she ended up in the hospital and did pass away. So, fast forward to the present day, this family's living in that house and they have two little boys, or they have a little boy, and the 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 little boy started talking about this babysitter, and he was having horrible night terrors. And one night, the couple got up and the kid was just screaming. And they come into the room and they finally got him calmed down and they said, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he said, well, that babysitter was there. She was there by the side of my bed. And they said, well, what does she look like? Well, he said, she was really nice. She has this kind of gray hair and she's kind of older. And she was really, really nice until she got hit in the head. Then she wasn't nice anymore. Now that to me is really creepy.
I got goosebumps right when you said that.
That is really creepy. That's probably the creepiest one. But then there's another one also that does really creep me out. And we have a place here I live in Helena, Montana, which is the capital city of Montana. And we have a long history of Catholicism here, and we have a place called Catholic Hill where there is well, it's a place where the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth played a big role in the history of Montana, but they came in 1869 with this threefold mission to teach children, to take care of the sick, and to well, I forget what the third part was, but anyway, to care for orphans. And so all three of those things happened on this place we call Catholic Hill. First orphanage was there, the first hospital was there, and the first cathedral was also on this hilltop. All of those places were destroyed in the earthquakes. We had serious earthquakes in 1935, and all of Catholic Hill was destroyed except for one building that is still there. But anyway, people here, I mean, and this really bugs me that people don't get the real history of places. So people who live in the apartments that are built on that hilltop believe that there was a cemetery there. There was never a cemetery there, but people have that impression. I don't know why they do. But anyway, the other thing that happened on that hilltop is that before the state hospital at Warm Springs was created in 1877, before that, between about 1869 and 1878 or so, the Sisters of Charity had care for the mentally ill in this house that today it would have been in the middle of the parking lot of this complex. And there was a house that they had used. And care of the mentally ill back then, they had no drugs. They didn't really have any care except that they would bind the person's wrists and their ankles and tie them to the chair, tie them to the bed, because they wanted to prevent them from hurting each other, themselves, and the sisters. And there's some harrowing stories that the sisters would tell about people who escaped and this kind of different thing. So anyway, I had done that research. Nobody knew that history of the hilltop. And I happened to interview a person who lived in one of those apartments that had this very freaky experience. And he told me he knew nothing about the history. He thought there was a cemetery there on the top of the hill. And he said he had been home by himself this one Saturday morning and mopping his kitchen floor. And all of a sudden, he began to smell this horrible, horrible odor. And he couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And he looked over to his front door, and the door was partly ajar, and he could see someone standing on the other side of the door. So he went and opened the door, and this weird person was standing there. He looked like he was out of place. His clothing was kind of ripped. He was very dirty. And he said, "Let me in. I want to come in." And Richard, the guy who rented the apartment, said, "I can't let you in. What do you want?" "I want to come in." And Richard slammed the door, because he was really afraid. And he thought to himself, "I better see where this guy is going, so I can report it." So he opened the door a few seconds later, and there was nobody around. So I said to Richard, "Well, do you know the history of this hilltop?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, there were people buried there, blah, blah, blah." No, 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 there weren't. But I said to him, "Do you know about the sisters and the, care of the mentally ill?" And so I told him about that. And he turned white and he said, the thing that was the most freaky about that whole experience was that he said the guy just looked like he didn't belong there. But he said that in retrospect, the thing that really bothered him was that the guy had these red, raw chafe marks around his wrists where he had obviously been top down.
The sisters sound like the most interesting thing to me so far. I'm just letting
Very
you know.
interesting. Yeah.
That's a gr th those are gr that's a great, I mean, a historical thing for, because, I mean, back then, it was just like you're looking at kind of everything and trying to understand it all in historical context, but, I mean, they were doing amazing things, it sounds like, taking care of a lot of people as well, too. My first thought went into my head, I was like, "Oh my god, you know what happens when people try and help other people? You get, like, the Salem witch trials or something like that."
Yeah, yeah, but in my experience, Catholic places are always haunted. I don't know why that is. I don't know. Maybe they have uh, a closer relationship with the other side than most people do. I don't know what it is.
When it comes to the books that you wrote, I mean, how did you choose what you wanted to incorporate in your books? Like, how many I mean, there's gotta be a wealth of stories out there that you could choose from.
Uh-huh. Well, I pretty much incorporate everything that has a historical context. The thing that I love the most about writing those stories is that it really allows me to talk about the history of places like Catholic Hill, for example, that other people don't know about. And it gives me the chance to tell what the history is of these places that people don't really know. And to me, that's the beauty of the stories. Yeah, they have a supernatural thread, but it's the history behind the story that to me as a historian that is really important. so so I like to choose places that nobody else is going to write about. I mean, there are some places, certain hotels and places that people have told the stories of them over and over and over again. I stay away from that because I like to concentrate on places that people don't usually know about.
Well, it's easy to write about a landmark when there's like a wealth of information and other people that have written about it, but doing your own kind of research into a specific thing or certain event makes it more fun because you get to put in the process. And then plus you get probably come across like I wouldn't call it a secret, but come across something that's like a bit of a mystery. And you're like, well, why is nobody talking about this?
Exactly. It's like that little house in Virginia City. Nobody would pay any attention to it. But, it has this great story behind it about Amanda McKean and her suicide. And, it makes it really interesting for people to read about, I think.
I have to ask this because do you have any type of, like, I wouldn't say prohibition type stuff that happened in Montana or bootleggers, anything like I have a little keen interest in bootleggers.
Yeah, we have this one great story. There's here in Helena, there's well, I have a couple of stories, and not necessarily, well, two of them are paranormal stories actually. There's
Tell them
this
all,
one.
tell them all.
Okay, well, there's this one homestead in Fergus County. And the lady who homesteaded there was an African American woman. And she came in the 1890s. We really don't know very much about her background or really much about her, but she homesteaded and she sort of carved a niche for herself during Prohibition, making really good moonshine. And people knew all over the region that Bertie Brown made the best and the safest moonshine, of anybody. Moonshine could be a very dangerous thing because if you got bad moonshine, you could go blind. You could actually poison yourself and die. And so her moonshine was always very safe and very good. And everybody knew the rutted road to Bertie Brown's homestead. And she would open her place, and she had a nice parlor, and they would have dancing there and parties and stuff. And so, 1933, right at the very end of Prohibition, of course, Prohibition in Montana started earlier than it did anywhere else in the nation. We had Prohibition in 1918, and it lasted until 1933, as it did elsewhere. But anyway, so she had a long run. And 1933, she was cooking a batch of moonshine in her cabin, and the authorities came. They knew that she was a moonshiner, and they caught her cooking this batch. And they told her, Bertie, you've been caught before. If I catch you again cooking this better be your last batch, because if I catch you again, we're going to have to take you to jail. So she's cooking this last batch, and she also took in laundry or took in cleaning, and they did cleaning back then with gasoline. And she got the gasoline too close to the
Oh, Birdie,
stove,
no.
and it exploded, and she was horribly, horribly burned. And she never lost consciousness, but for 48 hours she lay in the hospital. Her friends all came and gathered around her, and the last thing that she said was, please, please find my cat. Find my cat. He needs somebody to take care of him. She'd had this black cat that followed her everywhere. And she said, please find my cat and take care of him. And then she passed away. Her friends went out to the homestead, and they searched the fields. They searched everywhere for that cat, and they never found it. Well, the farmer, the rancher who owns that property today will tell you that more times than not, when he drives past that dilapidated homestead, he'll see a black cat sitting in the parlor window.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Oh, what sucks is, like, the amount, like, moonshine's legal now. I mean, they sell it in liquor stores, and it's a little bit ridiculous, but for God's sake, she's making the best moonshine where people aren't going blind.
I know. So and then the other story has to do with this place in Helena where I happen to have my office. And it's called Reader's Alley, and it's a place that was built as a series of apartments for miners. It was built between 1873 and 1884. It's a very, very charming little area that is sort of modeled on the row house idea that they used to have, that they used to use back east. And the guy who came was from Pennsylvania. He sort of incorporated this row house idea into this little collection of brick apartments. And so up at the top of the alley, it's kind of on a hill, and up at the top of the alley, there's this house, or this building that's called the Stone House, and it at one time had 4 apartments in it where miners lived. But by the 1910s and 20s, the front portion of this building was home to a woman by the name of Laura Duchesnay, or Duchesney, as her name was sort of corrupted in America. She was French, and she and her husband lived in this little front apartment. and she collected the rents from the men. By this time, there were no minors left, but there were all kinds of different men, only single men who lived in these apartments. And so she would collect the rents. And as I researched her, I just found one little thread about this woman who was a famous bird doctor. And I thought, well, maybe I could figure out who she was. And in fact, I did find Laura, and I found out that she bred canaries in this little tiny apartment. And I thought that was so interesting. I did a lot of research. I found her in the censuses, and I found her occupation in that little tiny apartment exactly corresponded to Prohibition, 1918, and she died in 1933. And when she died, the funeral was held in this little tiny apartment, and I can just imagine all her canaries, singing and this. But the story did evolve because later the building was a very popular restaurant for many, many years. It had been converted, the walls had been taken out, it's one just large building. And people who worked in that restaurant, I interviewed, and they told me that the place was haunted, and that they could hear children running down the hallways, that they could hear someone coughing in the rafters, and all these different things. And so I interviewed this one waitress, and I asked her, so what was your experience in the building? And she said, oh, well, it's definitely haunted. We all had these different things happen. And I said, well, did anything happen to you? She knew nothing about the history of this building. It was something that I just had discovered about the canaries. And so anyway, she says, well, there was this one really weird thing that happened this one time. And she said it was after midnight. She said, we're expecting a big crowd. It was Valentine's Day the next day. And she said she had drawn the short straw, and she had to stay late and get all the tablecloths on the tables and everything ready. And it was after midnight. She was really tired. She was done. She went to the front door and put her hand on the doorknob. She said all of a sudden she heard this chirping. And she thought, oh no, a bird has gotten locked in the building. I'm going to have to get it out, or it's going to fly around all night. It's going to poop all over my white tablecloths, and I'm going to get fired. So she's looking for this bird, and she couldn't find it. And finally, she said she went back to the front door, put her hand on the doorknob, and shut her eyes, thinking maybe she could better pinpoint the sound, if her eyes were shut. And so she said as she shut her eyes, she could hear what sounded like a whole flock of little tiny birds. She said she could hear their wings beating the ceiling as they flew in a group all the way to the very back dining room. And then the sound was gone, and she never found a bird. So I told her, I asked her, do you know about Laura's canaries? And I told her about that, and she sort of turned white, and she said, oh my gosh, if I had known that, maybe I never would have come back to work here. So anyway, that was one of the early stories that I collected and wrote down in my first book. And after that, people came to me and would tell me how they had heard the canaries in the building. And it's become a very famous story. And the canaries in the stone house, a lot of people since have experienced that. But the other interesting thing about that is that for many years, I taught Montana history at the local college here. And usually I had an eclectic mix of students. And one year I had this rather elderly student, and we were talking about the history of Reader's Alley and its significance and stuff. And she said, I remember my grandfather told me a story about the lady that lived in that apartment there in the stone house. And he said that she was known to be a moonshiner, and that people knew that when they came to Reader's Alley at certain times of the month, they could buy her moonshine, and her moonshine was really good. And so apparently she she realized that people were afraid of coming and lining up because they would line up all the way down the alley. And people were afraid that the revenue officer would come around and say, what are you lining up for? So she would bring out all of her cages of canaries and line the alley with the cages. And if anyone asked, what are you lining up for? People could just say, we're here to buy canaries.
That's so smart.
Yeah. So canaries were kind of the front for something else. And in the building, when they converted, the building is now, part of the building is now a conference center. And when they installed wiring under the floor for computers, they cut out a section of the flooring to install this wiring, and they discovered a hidden room down there. And there was a homemade ladder going down into this kind of hole. And, we think that's probably where she kept her moonshine.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've heard, like, with some bootleggers, like, they use certain animals. Someone have dogs, someone have birds. Mostly it was for, like, alerts. They would set them up and, like, nearby so they could hear, if somebody was coming or something like that. But that's fast. I'm surprised they found a little room. That's like, when you hear about, like, they found Al Capone's safe or something like that
I
on a
know,
wall.
I know. And it's funny because I didn't know at the time, I hadn't heard that story of the moon shining. And when they uncovered that room, the reporters were there from the local TV station. And it's like, well, what do you think that room was for? And I just sort of joking, I said, oh, it's probably where, somebody hid moonshine. And that actually is what it turned out to be.
How difficult is it for you when you go and try and find like the historical record or try and trace the history just because sometimes things might get in there that necessarily aren't true?
Well, oftentimes, if it's a place that is remote, it's very, very difficult to trace, things. There are things that the historians use, like we have great historic maps of towns and places where the railroad came, But if it's a homestead or something that's in an outlying area, it's very difficult to find the history of that unless you have the name of the person. If you have the name, then oftentimes you can research things. But people call me all the time and say, I have this house and, it's kind of out in the suburbs and, these things are happening, but it's not a place that's ever been mapped, or it's not a place, it's a place that's more recent. It's very difficult to do historical research in places like that just because there really aren't a lot of resources for places that don't have a lot of records.
Does Montana have like a library or a place that has a lot of records? Like I figure like
Absolutely.
some of those have to be online as well too.
Yeah, the Montana Historical Society Research Center is really the collective memory of Montana, and they are the stewards of Montana's memory, and they have a wonderful library. The two universities also have great archives, and oftentimes, you can find a lot of information in what we call vertical files, which are files of clippings, newspaper clippings, and that kind of thing. But now, with newspapers.com and ancestry.com, you can sit at home and do a lot of historical research that we used to have to do in the libraries. So it's a much, much easier to do research at home than it ever used to be.
I think people are generally curious about the place that they live and a little bit about where they come from. I've
Yeah, I think so too.
I've talked to a couple genealogists and, trying to trace and use they tell me all the sites they use and all the way that they're able to trace. And I think that's what people want to know. I mean, I think there's some people out there that just don't really care, but I feel like at some point they do get a bit of curiosity. I mean, it doesn't have to be something as serious as like, is there a medical condition in your family? It could just be like, hey, what am I made of? Like, there's so many different, I wouldn't say, I guess travelers from overseas or something that came over during the early periods of America. And next thing, like I'm every country that basically hates each other all wrapped up into one. And like, that's interesting to me, but like, you look up to your grandparents to tell you that kind of oral history of things. And then sometimes you have some family members, like my grandma was very secret about all of this type of stuff. She dated one of the Secret Service men who worked with Kennedy. So it's like, like, so like she never talked about that. And like it's like I'm finding that out way later. And I'm now interested in the Kennedy assassination. So it's like, oh my God, why didn't this happen earlier when she was alive? But
Yeah.
get
Oh, it's
interested in
always
it.
in retrospect that we wish we had quizzed our relatives, our parents, our grandparents, quizzed them more about their backgrounds. It's I think everybody has that experience of, oh, I wish I had asked, this question or that question. But we do have a lot of resources, and there are resources, that are international resources. Find a Grave is one really great resource if you want to find out where someone was buried and you have their death date. You can pretty much find a picture of their headstone oftentimes. Findagrave.com is a really great resource, and Sanborn maps are the other thing, historic maps that I mentioned. Oftentimes, those are online. You can find them at the Library of Congress. For any community that had a railroad coming to it, because um, they were drawn. It's a series of maps that were drawn. You can look at a house and you can see when certain additions were made and that kind of thing. And that's the kind of research that I really like to do on places. I always start there because I like to see what changes were made to a certain place. But again, there's no maps for outlying remote places, so sometimes those places are very difficult to research.
Yeah, whatever. I'm reaching out to someone who's like I said, part of the Kennedy topic. I use Wikipedia. When I hit Wikipedia and it goes was, I was like, oh, they're no longer alive. I'm not gonna be able to speak to them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's I came across the topic a lot later than a lot of people have been researching it for a while, and I think there's just important stuff in our history that doesn't get mainstream taught. And I'm wondering, in Montana, do they teach a lot of the strictly Montana history in some of the
Well,
education?
in fourth grade, they do a little bit of Montana history. We have a recent middle school textbook that is strictly Montana history. And, you can take Montana history in college, but, they don't really teach a lot of, they don't, not every school teaches that. And there's so many standards, the teachers have to adhere to, that it's difficult to do anything that's very technical, I guess, about any given place. And it's really too bad, because, and I think a lot of times teachers aren't really trained in teaching certain courses, and I find that teachers teach things in Montana history, things that aren't really accurate, and that's too bad, because that's the way certain myths get perpetuated. And it's always been my job to try to unravel those myths and try to tell people the truth. But sometimes myths are really hard to let go of, so it's a hard job.
Well, Ellen, I really appreciate you giving me the time to talk on my show, and I appreciate the work that you do also, and researching the history of Montana. Is there a place where people can find your links?
I have a wonderful blog, and it is just, you can it's called Montana Moments Blogspot. If you go to that, you can find a searchable a blog that I did for a long, long time that has a lot of really interesting short little stories about Montana history. And people really enjoy that. So there's that, and you can find me on Facebook, and you can find all my books on Amazon.com too.
Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.